The studio lights dimmed as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked onto the late-night talk show set, her emerald green blazer sharp against the dark backdrop. Just moments before host Bill Maher had made a comment that sent shockwaves through the audience. A remark about urban politicians playing the race card that many saw as a direct attack on black representatives like Crockett. The 33-year-old Texas Democrat had been invited to discuss criminal justice reform, but what happened next would turn a routine political interview into a viral moment that dominated social media for weeks. Maher, known for his provocative style and decades of controversial takes, thought he could easily handle another young politician, but he was wrong. What Crockett did in the following 20 minutes did not just surprise him. It left him visibly shaken, scrambling for responses and facing the biggest backlash of his career. This was not just a political disagreement, it was a masterclass in how to dismantle someone who underestimated their opponent. Bill Maher sat behind his familiar desk, the same spot where he had hosted politicians, celebrities, and intellectuals for over 2 decades. At 68, the comedian-turned-political commentator had built his reputation on saying what others would not dare. His show had become a weekly destination for political junkies, known for its panel discussions and Maher's often controversial monologues. He prided himself on being politically incorrect, claiming he spoke truth to power regardless of who got offended. He had survived multiple scandals, lost shows, and bounced back stronger each time. His audience loved his willingness to challenge both sides of the political spectrum, though critics often accused him of crossing lines, particularly when discussing race and social issues. Tonight he had planned what seemed like a standard segment on criminal justice reform. He had done hundreds of these interviews with politicians, and in his mind this would be another chance to showcase his sharp wit against a relatively new congresswoman. Jasmine Crockett represented Texas's 30th congressional district, but her influence extended far beyond Dallas. At 33, she had already established herself as one of the most articulate and fearless voices in Congress. A former public defender and civil rights lawyer, she had fought in courtrooms long before stepping into political arenas. Crockett had grown up understanding the justice system from both sides, seeing how it failed communities of color, while also knowing how to use legal arguments to fight back. Her background was not just political theory, it was lived experience. She had come to the show expecting a serious discussion about prison reform and police accountability, but she did not expect Maher's opening comment that would change the entire tone of the evening. Yet she was no stranger to hostile judges, aggressive prosecutors, or dismissive colleagues. She was not intimidated by a talk show host. This confrontation represented more than just two people disagreeing. Maher embodied a type of liberal comedian who believed his progressive credentials gave him permission to make comments about race that others could not. Crockett represented a new generation of black political leaders who refused to let such remarks slide even from supposed allies. The audience watching included millions of Americans grappling with conversations about racism, whether it could hide behind humor, and who gets to decide what crosses the line. For Maher, this was supposed to be another episode, but for Crockett it became an opportunity to address something much bigger than one man's comment. The winner of this exchange would shape how similar conversations happened in the future. The trouble began during Maher's opening monologue before Crockett even appeared. While discussing recent political developments, he veered into commentary about urban politicians. "You know what I love about these young representatives from urban districts," he said with his trademark smirk. "They have figured out the perfect political strategy. Just call everything racist and watch your opponent scramble." The audience gave uncertain laughter, some clapping while others remained silent. Maher continued, "It is like having a trump card you can play anytime someone disagrees with your policies. Cannot defend your position on crime, racism. Someone questions your budget proposals, obviously racist." It is brilliant, really. Behind the scenes, Crockett's team immediately recognized the problem. Her communications director whispered urgently into his phone while her chief of staff pulled up clips on his tablet. They knew this was not just a casual comment, but a talking point that had been used to dismiss black politicians for decades. When Maher introduced Crockett, his tone carried an undertone that regular viewers would recognize. "Joining me now is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, who I am sure will have some very strong opinions about criminal justice reform," he said, emphasizing the words in a way that suggested he expected her to prove his earlier point. Crockett walked out with a professional smile, but those who knew her could see the steel in her eyes. She had heard the opening monologue from the green room, she had seen her staff's concerned faces, and she had already decided how this interview would go. As she settled into the guest chair, Mar leaned back with the confidence of someone who had done this dance thousands of times. Congresswoman, thanks for joining us. I was just talking about how young politicians from urban areas approach political discourse these days. What is your take on that? The question seemed innocent enough, but Crockett recognized it immediately as a trap. If she answered defensively, she would be proving his point. If she ignored it, she would be letting a harmful stereotype stand unchallenged on national television. Well, Bill, Crockett began, her voice steady and measured, I think it is interesting that you would characterize political discourse from urban areas in that way. Can you be more specific about what you mean? Mar shifted slightly, perhaps sensing this was not going to be as easy as he had expected. I just mean that sometimes, and I am speaking generally here, there is a tendency to attribute disagreement to racism rather than engaging with actual policy substance. I see. Crockett nodded. And when you say sometimes, are you referring to specific instances? Because as someone who spent years in courtrooms dealing with actual policy substance, I am curious about these examples you have in mind. The audience was quiet now, sensing the tension building. Mar's usual confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. Well, I do not want to call out specific people. Oh, but you already did, Crockett interrupted gently. You specifically mentioned young representatives from urban districts. That is a pretty specific demographic, would you not say? Mar tried to regain control of the conversation. Look, I am just saying that sometimes legitimate policy disagreements get characterized as racist when they are really not. I think we can have honest conversations about crime policy, for instance, without someone immediately playing the race card. The phrase playing the race card hung in the air like a challenge. Crockett's expression did not change, but anyone watching closely could see her jaw tighten slightly. The race card, she repeated slowly. That is an interesting phrase, Bill. Tell me, when someone points out actual racial disparities in our criminal justice system, disparities that are documented by data from your own government agencies, what would you call that? I would call it bringing up relevant facts, Mar said, clearly not seeing where she was heading. Exactly, Crockett said, leaning forward slightly. So when I mention that Black Americans are incarcerated at roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans for the same crimes according to federal statistics, am I playing the race card, or am I bringing up relevant facts? Mar paused, realizing he had walked into something. Well, those are statistics, right? Facts, data, evidence. Crockett's voice remained calm, but her words carried increasing weight. So help me understand then, Bill. Understand, Bill. When exactly does citing documented evidence become playing the race card? Is there a specific threshold, a particular tone I should avoid? Should I ask permission before mentioning racial disparities that affect my constituents? The audience was fully engaged now, some leaning forward in their seats. This was not the usual back and forth they expected from these interviews. Mar, known for his quick wit and ability to control conversations, was clearly struggling to regain his footing. I am not saying you cannot mention racial disparities, he said, his voice slightly defensive. I am talking about when everything becomes about race, even when it might not be everything. Crockett repeated. That is another interesting word choice. Can you give me an example of when I have made everything about race inappropriately? Mar looked uncomfortable. Well, I am not specifically talking about you personally, but you introduced me as someone from an urban district right after a monologue about politicians who supposedly call everything racist. So either you were talking about me personally or you were making assumptions about me based on where I represent. Which is it? The trap was now fully visible to everyone in the studio. Mar had painted himself into a corner with his own words, and Crockett was systematically closing off his escape routes. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering to each other. This was not going according to their usual script. The show's executive producer, a veteran of decades in television, had never seen anything quite like this unfold in real time. Their guest was not just defending herself, she was systematically dismantling their host's credibility, using his own words against him. The social media manager, monitoring online reactions in real time, was watching the engagement numbers spike beyond anything they had seen before. Comments were flooding in faster than the moderation team could handle them. Some viewers were praising Crockett's intelligence and preparation while others were expressing shock at seeing their familiar host so thoroughly outmaneuvered. "Should we go to commercial?" whispered one producer to another, but the executive producer shook his head. Whatever was happening, it was television gold, the kind of unscripted moment that would be talked about for years. They had to let it play out. Meanwhile, in the green room where other potential guests waited for future segments, a prominent political consultant was quietly taking notes on his phone. He recognized immediately that he was watching a masterclass in political communication that would be studied in campaign schools and media training programs across the country. The camera operators, veterans of countless political interviews, were making subtle adjustments to capture the full drama of the moment. They zoomed in on Mar's increasingly uncomfortable expressions, caught Crockett's composed confidence, and panned occasionally to audience members whose faces showed they understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The show's head writer, responsible for crafting Mar's usual sharp comebacks and witty responses, was sitting helplessly as his carefully prepared material became irrelevant. This was not a scripted exchange where clever one-liners would save the day. This was a systematic deconstruction of assumptions and stereotypes that required substantive responses. Mar clearly was not prepared to give security personnel trained to handle disruptions from audience members or unexpected events found themselves in uncharted territory. There was no disruption to manage, no crisis to contain, just a guest who was using intelligence and preparation to completely change the power dynamics of their host's own show. Mar attempted to deflect by changing the subject. "Look, let us talk about your criminal justice reform proposals. Some critics say they are too soft on crime, especially for violent offenses." But Crockett was not going to let him escape that easily. "I am happy to discuss policy, Bill, but first I think we should address what just happened here. You made some pretty serious implications about how politicians like me operate, and I think your audience deserves clarification." She turned slightly toward the audience, acknowledging them directly. "Because here is what I heard in your opening monologue and your questions to me. You suggested that politicians from urban districts, and let us be honest about what that is, code for routinely cry racism instead of engaging in substantive policy discussions." Mar tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued smoothly. "You used the phrase playing the race card, which has a very specific history and meaning, and then you brought me on as an example of this supposed problem. So let us talk about that. I am a former public defender who spent years in courtrooms before running for office." Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have represented clients facing decades in prison, fought for police accountability measures, and worked on legislation that has reduced recidivism rates in Texas by 12% over the past 2 years. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small folder. "I brought some statistics with me tonight because I believe in backing up my positions with facts. Would you like to see them?" Mar, clearly uncomfortable with how the tables had turned, nodded reluctantly. "Texas Department of Criminal Justice data shows that our evidence-based reform programs have saved taxpayers $47 million while reducing repeat offenses. The reforms I have advocated for are based on successful models from red states like Georgia and Texas implemented by Republican governors." She set the folder on Mar's desk. "These are not emotional appeals, Bill. This is evidence-based policymaking. So when you suggest that politicians like me just play the race card instead of doing substantive work, what exactly are you basing that on?" Mar reached for his usual deflection tactics. "I am not saying you specifically, but your—" Crockett interrupted, her tone still professional, but increasingly pointed. "You brought me on this show immediately after making those comments. You introduced me in a way that connected me to your opening monologue. So let me ask you directly, have you actually looked at my legislative record? Do you know what bills I have sponsored, what committees I serve on, what my background is?" The silence stretched for several seconds, an eternity in television time. Mar's mouth opened and closed without producing words. His usual quick wit seemed to have completely abandoned him, leaving him looking exactly like what he was in this moment, unprepared and exposed.